I will say it's a very rainy day in Kansas City, and hopefully a little lighter in the Illinois area. My co-founder and business partners in Florida, so we won't talk about the sunshine, I guess, that's going on right there today, right?
It's a very sunny blue sky today.
Exactly. So we have 60 minutes together. And our hope today in that 60 minutes is to provide you with some specific tools on how to manage and support your grieving employees. We also had a question in the chat a couple of days ago, and she mentioned, will this also help us in our personal lives? And our hope is yes. The tactics and the strategies and some of the solutions we're going to be talking about today when in regards to grief also work for us personally as well. So we hope that you'll take that as a strong takeaway. So we're going to be talking about the problem and prevalence of grief in the workplace. We're going to talk about some specific insights on what is foggy brain and how does that affect an employee and how does it affect their productivity and the ability to do their job. We're also going to talk about the downstream effects of grief, and what that means is absenteeism, presenteeism. We'll be going into more specifics on presenteeism, and also making sure that when you walk away today, we have strong solutions on what you can do as HR leaders and what you can do to help your managers support those employees when they come back to work. We're going to be also allowing some time at the end for Q&A, and we also are monitoring the chat within the conference app if you have any questions throughout the presentation. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to my co-founder and business partner, Mindy Corporon.
Thank you, Lisa. So you may be wondering, from where did we get all of this information about downstream effects, foggy brain, presenteeism, etc. Well, I'm going to share just a little bit about my story to introduce you to who I am and how workplace healing came to be. I was a CEO at a wealth management firm in 2014. And in April of 2014, I was a wife and a mother to 2 boys. And mid-April, there was a tragic incident that happened in Overland Park, Kansas. And when I mention it, you might actually remember what happened. It was international news. My dad and son were murdered at the Jewish Community Center in Overland Park, Kansas. Now, I talk about it all the time. It became part of my life. It is part of my life. So when you hear me talking about this, I want you to understand that my life was shattered, our family was shattered, but we have taken so many steps for growth to work through all of that. And that's where so much of our material originally started. So what happened after they were murdered is I could hardly function. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't feed myself. I couldn't go back to work for a while. I went back to work about 5 weeks afterward, and full time about 5 weeks after. And I had thought, as the CEO and co-founder of my own firm, I mean, we even built out the office space. I had hired everyone at the firm except my co-founder, my business partner at the time. I had thought that reintegrating into work would have been easier. It was not. It was difficult. And what I realized in that position of having so much flexibility was that if I was struggling, then what are other people doing? What are all other people, employees who are working in thousands and millions of places? What do they do when they experience grief and then they want to go back to work? And on the other hand, what does the CEO or the manager or the director of human resources do when they're onboarding someone? You see, we were in a small company and I was overseeing human resources myself. We were outsourcing to someone and they were helpful. We also had an EAP, we had an employee assistance plan in place. And I still struggled and our company struggled. So with my skill set of being an entrepreneur and running a company and hiring people, I had that skill set, but I was losing compassion for what I was doing. And I decided that I wanted to put my new skill set of understanding being a griever and understanding being a corporate leader and understanding the process of bringing a griever back in. I felt like workplace healing would be a good thing for me to transition to. And Lisa Cooper and I joined forces in 2018 to start considering, what does that look like? Now, my tragedy is huge, and there have been other tragedies like it that you might have experienced yourself. If so, I'm very sorry for that. And or you have heard of them. Everyone has heard of some tragedy that has happened in the news regarding gun violence or massive shootings, etc. So there are well-known events that happen. Likely, those don't happen to mass people really across the board. So what's important to know is that we did a lot of research, not just on my situation, but a lot of research on what does this look like for everyday people and corporate people who they've never had a big incident like this happen, but they've had normal situations. So let me give you an example, and it's a true example. I had been back to work several years. It was 2017. It was December of 17. And a bank president approached me at a holiday gathering. And he wanted to know from me if I wouldn't mind talking to him about a grieving employee he had. So if you've ever had a grieving employee and you know of someone who's lost someone else and they've gone through grief, you might also feel like on some point you want to ask them a question. So this is what he did. He asked me a question about his grieving employee. And here's what happened. I said, "What have you done for her?" And he just had this blank stare in his face. He said, "Well, what do you mean? What have I done for her?" So we went back and forth on what did I mean about that? What was I trying to explain to him about what had he done? And I have to tell you, I had been a griever and a CEO, and I found myself really struggling to explain to him what he should have done. But what I realized is that he had done nothing. And he told me that he had done nothing because he didn't want to hurt her anymore. He didn't want to bring it up. He didn't want to talk about it. He wanted them to work. He didn't want to bring in her personal life. So if this sounds like something that you've encountered either yourself or with your own employer, that's what we want you to understand, is that this company was created and our educational material was all founded on what do all humans really experience together, and how can we as humans help one another working through grief in the workplace. Thanks.
So working through grief, Mindy mentioned her personal story as well as a commonplace situation that happens all the time in companies. But let's look at the research. When we started out with our company, we did a significant amount of both qualitative and quantitative research because we really wanted to get to the heart of what is the prevalence of grief in the workplace. We know that 25% of employees are grieving at any given time. This was actually a pre-COVID number. And what's interesting here is when we talk about grief, it can also mean the death of a pet, the death of an unborn child. So there's many factors of grief that go into it, but it's important for HR leaders and managers to understand that 25% of employees are grieving at any given time. We also, as you can see, we're very concerned about the effect of grief on retention. And again, when we did a significant amount of research on this, we found that nearly 59% of people, let's say their bereavement leave at their company is 5 days. We know the average is 3 to 5 days. They come back to work on day 6. And if they are ignored, if people are afraid to make eye contact with them, if they don't feel supported when they're sitting back in their cubicle and everyone's ignoring them, they're going to be looking for another job. And we have a significant amount of research to prove it. So when they come back to work and they don't feel supported, they start considering starting over fresh somewhere else. And we also know about the billions of dollars that corporate America is hemorrhaging every year on errors that people come back to work and they're not fully present, and just productivity loss. So it's very significant. We also look at what we call the downstream effects of grief. And specifically what this means is that we're looking at absenteeism, which is literally they're not at work, as you know, and we know the cost of that. It's easy to track. We can look at the PTO, we can look at the time off, we can look at extra time off, and we know exactly who is taking time off and how much that's costing your company. But we also know about presenteeism, and that's when someone is truly back at work and they're present in their office or their cubicle, but they're not emotionally present. And this was actually one of the poll questions that we had asked early on. And over the majority of you all had said you hadn't heard about presenteeism. So we're going to make sure today in our presentation that we dive a little bit deeper into presenteeism. But just so you know now, it's costing 10 times more than absenteeism. So we'd like you to consider on the right side of our screen here, your workplace. And when you think about the number of absenteeisms, the number of bereavements, maybe if there's any coworkers that have passed away in the last year at your company, or even how many deaths have been affected your employee base, we know that when one person loses a family member, the circle of influence on that is on average 9 people. So there's one death, one person passes away, and that one passing affects 9 people, clearly people that are also working. And then we want to think about, when you think about your own companies, how that's affected your teams, how that's affected maybe a productivity, how it's affected morale. So keep those in mind as we move through the presentation. But as we go now into more of a, we'd like to educate you now on what is foggy brain and what is truly the effect of grief on the brain. Mindy?
Thanks, Lisa. I like to say that Lisa has to talk about all the stats and I get to share all the stories. So here we are on the slide that we're talking about your employee's brain on grief. And the reason that unfortunately that this is easy for me to talk about is because I experienced all of it. So I can speak from a griever's perspective, and I can also speak from, I was the CEO at the time when all of this happened to me. And I knew as the CEO, I needed me back. I knew I needed me to work. I knew I needed me to meet with clients, etc. But as a griever, I really struggled. So Lisa started with foggy brain. So we'll start with that, foggy brain. So foggy brain is real. If you have never personally experienced grief yourself, foggy brain, what happens is the neurochemicals in our body change. So there's serotonin and other hormones that change in our body, and our brain fogs over, and it limits us from being able to do simple things like organize, plan, follow through, remember things. It changes our memory. So trauma and then grief, grief which can cause trauma, or just trauma in general, because those things are really different. Grief is the process of sadness and working through what might be traumatic, but these things really do affect our bodies. So not just in our brain, but our whole physical body. You will feel pain in your heart, or your body will ache if you have a serious trauma or grief in your life, if you have not already. Let's talk about disengaged. Well, if you can't think straight, it's pretty easy to disengage. I can't tell you really how many times I could be in a meeting, and we've heard this from many other people. They'll be in a meeting and someone is talking to them, and all of a sudden they realize they didn't hear anything that they said. So our griever doesn't hear what's said. Our griever may be thinking about the funeral planning, or they may be thinking about the estate planning, or they may be just thinking that I don't have that person with me anymore. I lost my mom and I can't call her anymore. So those things, when they are traumatic, they really do take our brain away from what might be right in front of us. So that's disengaged. I'm going to move on to working too much. So working too much is actually prevalent and can be a problem, and can also cause errors. Lisa was talking about the statistic on errors, about $114 billion in errors. And that can happen when we're foggy brained, we're disengaged, and it can happen when we're working too much, we're overworked. So when we want to find a path to healing or to not feeling the pain, we might create things to do so we don't feel the pain or don't feel the grief. We don't want to feel it or talk about it or think about it. So we just dive back into work. If you have grievers that come back into work real quickly, and you might be surprised, oh, they came back, they bounced back real quickly, please be prepared for them to crash and burn at some point in time. Now, certainly it depends on what type of trauma or grief instance they went through, but it's very frequent for people, a lot of times men, to come back into the workplace and just dive back into work. And you're thinking they're fine, and they're overworking and they're getting all these projects done, but you might realize in a month or two, there are more mistakes than they've ever made before. And then they might have some kind of implosion. They might ask for a significant amount of time off later. Those are things that can happen when there are ebbs and flows, because that's what grief is like. Down and out. Well, that's, depression. That can be just mopey, not real energetic, not engaged. So you were disengaged, you can be down and out. It's very similar. If you notice that you used to have a very energetic person and now you don't have that energetic person, it's going to take time, but it doesn't just take time to move through grief. It actually takes action, actually takes doing something and having people walk alongside you. So that's what you all are here for. That's why you're here listening to our education presentation. What can you do as human resource specialists and operating officers in the human resource department and generalists, et cetera? What can you do for your humans? And you want to walk beside them. So that's why we're sharing all of this information. Illness. Well, if you're not taking care of yourself very well, it's really likely that you're going to get ill. Grief can have you feel certain physical feelings, but if you're also not sleeping well, then your immune system goes down. And if your immune system goes down and you're in a rainy place like Kansas City today, it could be that you could catch a cold, you could catch the flu. Obviously, we all know we could catch COVID from a variety of places. So illness can all of a sudden start being prevalent. Headaches, all types of things. And let me give you another scenario of a random reason why a headache might occur. When we're not feeling well, we might want to eat or drink things to make us feel better. Okay. No judgment here. I've done all of that. But when we eat or drink things that we want to band-aid how we feel, they can make us sick. They could give us a headache. It could be too much sugar for us. It could be all kinds of things. It could be that, we just eat too much and we just get sick from that, or we don't eat enough and we get sick from that. So there's so many things that can happen when we're processing through that. We're going to touch more later on seeking purpose, but we did have a polling question about post-traumatic growth, and I'll get into that when Lisa's talking about post-traumatic growth. We'll make sure and share the polling answers to that. So seeking purpose, when someone is taken from our lives, really at any time, but certainly in a tragic, drastic manner, or could be a child that has cancer for a long period of time, could be just a great person that you know and love, and it's so debilitating that they lost their life. They were such a giving, caring person. It's devastating, and we want to seek a reason why. We all ask that question, why? And so that's where seeking purpose comes from. Seeking purpose may not ever answer why did this happen, but it could help us move forward. It could help us seek growth, and that's where post-traumatic growth comes from. Lisa?